Hello, my name is Sloane, and 3 days after my wedding, I realized my life was already a battlefield. My parents had treated me like a burden all my life, dismissing every sacrifice, every late night, every moment I put their needs before my own. They didn't know I had inherited $10 million from Grandpa, and they would stop at nothing to take it. I watched subtle glances, whispered comments, even Brian's too keen smiles, and I wondered, how far would they really go to claim what was mine? And what would I do when the people I trusted the most became the ones plotting against me? The morning sun streamed through the plantation shutters of our Houston home, striping the hardwood floors in light. I sat at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee, the warmth in my hands steadying me as the room bustled with preparations for the first family brunch after Celine's wedding. Everything looked calm on the surface, but unease churned in my stomach. Hidden beneath polite smiles was a truth no one else knew. Grandpa had left me $10 million. On the counter sat a small silver locket engraved with his initials, a quiet reminder of his faith in me and a secret anchor against the storm of family expectation. My parents, Elaine and Roger, moved about briskly, polishing details to perfection. To them, perfect meant drawing attention to their sacrifices, rarely acknowledging mine. I sipped my coffee, reminding myself why silence was my greatest ally. Bryn, my older sister, drifted in wearing a peach blouse, her smile as polished as her tone. Grandpa always did have a soft spot for the youngest, she teased. Wonder what gifts you inherited this time. She laughed lightly, but the edge was clear. I held her gaze for a moment, fingers tightening on my mug. He was generous to all of us, I answered calmly, revealing nothing. I studied the room, watching the glances exchanged, the subtle nods and suppressed curiosity. My father's jaw tightened whenever Brian, my husband, laughed too heartily. My mother hovered closer than necessary, her hand resting lightly on the back of my chair, a quiet reminder of control. Their movements weren't hostile, but calculated, as though circling prey. Memories pressed in. Birthdays where my ideas were brushed aside, graduations where my role was barely acknowledged, dinners where my voice was politely dismissed. I had been the quiet one, the observer, the youngest. But invisibility had trained me well. Now, with Grandpa's legacy safely in my name, I carried a new kind of power, quiet, cautious, deliberate. As brunch unfolded, the conversation meandered to gifts, homes, futures. My cousins and Bryn dropped sugary remarks meant to cut. The youngest always manages to surprise us. Their tones carried envy wrapped in charm. I smiled, revealing nothing, letting their curiosity gnaw at them while I remained still. I watched Brian closely. He carried on with casual warmth, unaware of the undercurrents, while my parents studied him too intently. Roger's eyes lingered, calculating. Elaine pressed her lips together, assessing. They didn't know the truth, but they were already looking for leverage. I touched the locket, its cool weight reminding me of Grandpa's wisdom. The fortune wasn't only money, it was freedom, security, and a test. Could I wield it without letting them consume it? I intended to. The brunch passed in waves of chatter, but beneath the surface, I saw more. My mother whispered something to Bryn. My father gestured toward Brian's coffee. They thought I didn't notice, but I cataloged every detail. They were probing, testing, waiting for me to slip. But patience was my weapon. When I rose to clear my plate, I felt their eyes follow me. Each glance carried unspoken assumptions, envy hidden under civility. My stomach tightened, but I kept my posture even, my movements fluid. At the sink, I let the smallest smile curve my lips. They had no idea. They didn't know about the $10 million. They didn't know I had anticipated their questions. And they certainly didn't know how far I was willing to go to protect what was mine. As the brunch wound down, plates stacked and small talk faded. Relatives drifted out, while Brian packed his briefcase. He caught my eye and gave me a quiet nod. I returned it, a silent understanding between us. The orchestration had only begun. At the doorway, I glanced back at my parents. Their faces were neutral, but their eyes betrayed expectation. I knew they were plotting. What they didn't know was how much further ahead I already was. Years of being overlooked had trained me for this exact moment. I lingered in the sunlight, breathing in the faint residue of coffee, food, and curiosity. The brunch had been polite, but the air vibrated with envy and calculation. I exhaled slowly, steadying myself. The game had started, and I was ready to play it with patience, foresight, and precision. I tried to focus on the wedding photos spread across the kitchen counter, but my mind kept drifting back to brunch, the lingering stares, the carefully light comments about the youngest child's inheritance. It felt less like casual chatter and more like rehearsal. I couldn't shake the suspicion that the moment I walked out, the real maneuvering had begun. Brian sat across from me, sipping coffee, his tone soft and almost playful. "So, Sloane," he said, "have you thought about how we might handle family finances? Just to be smart about it, with everything coming up." I froze for a breath. His words were light, affectionate even, but probing. His eyes flicked toward the empty chairs my parents had left behind. I leaned back, keeping my voice calm. "We'll figure that out in time," I said evenly. He smiled faintly, but I noted his question in the same mental ledger I'd been building since brunch. Later, my phone buzzed with a text from Leora, a distant cousin who had always read the family's politics well. "Saw something that might matter. Watch closely." She'd caught Brian glancing at the old family ledger. My pulse quickened, not with fear, but with recognition. I wasn't alone in my suspicions. I retreated to the study, opening my laptop under a shaft of sunlight. Piece by piece, I recorded the morning. Bryn's sugar-coated jabs, my parents' watchful eyes, Brian's probing remark. Each was a puzzle piece slotting into a larger picture. Years of being overlooked. The birthdays, graduations, family dinners where my efforts went unnoticed, had trained me to observe with precision. What once hurt had become my strength. By midday, I found Brian in the kitchen, reviewing papers with a faint, knowing smile. I wondered what he'd picked up, or if he, too, was now part of my parents' quiet strategy. I sipped my coffee, steadying myself, knowing the game had already begun. A knock at the door interrupted. Mrs. Carrington, our neighbor, stopped by with congratulations, lingering near the coffee table just long enough for her eyes to catch the ledger Brian had left open. Her glance wasn't subtle. I realized she could become either an ally or a witness, another thread in the web tightening around me. The afternoon revealed patterns, subtle tests, reactions, recalibrations, Bryn's hints, my parents' body language, Brian's probing, all of it followed choreography. My role was to anticipate and guide without showing my hand. I pulled the ledger closer, tracing the entries with my finger. Grandpa's 10 million sat quietly under my name, untouched by their assumptions. It wasn't just wealth. It was leverage, a shield, a reminder that I had power where they believed I had none. Brian and I walked the neighborhood as the sun stretched shadows across the pavement. I studied his tone, his pauses, the small gestures that revealed his comfort or unease around the subject of family money. Every detail mattered. When we returned, a folded note lay beneath the door. "Don't trust appearances. Eyes are everywhere." Anonymous, but pointed. My pulse quickened again. Between Leora's tip, Mrs. Carrington's glance, and now this warning, it was clear. The circle of observation was widening. And by evening, the house was quiet. Brian busied himself with dinner while I reviewed the day's signals, mentally rehearsing the conversations and confrontations to come. My parents were absent, but their presence lingered like a shadow over every move. In that shadow, I found clarity. Their plotting, Brian's subtle questions, the anonymous warnings, all of it formed a puzzle I was now piecing together. Patience and precision would be my allies. Every glance, every word, every silence would count. And as I closed the ledger for the night, I knew the real game had begun. I couldn't shake the feeling that today's casual conversations were anything but casual. They were rehearsals for a play I wasn't ready to perform in. The sunlight through the study window cast warm streaks across the desk, but my mind was elsewhere, dissecting every nuance from breakfast and the subtle looks exchanged at brunch. Brian was nearby, leaning casually against the doorway, his posture relaxed yet deliberate, a gentle pressure that made my awareness spike. He wasn't overt, but the way he lingered, asking small, seemingly innocent questions about plans for family finances, hinted at an interest far deeper than mere curiosity. I took a deep breath and reminded myself to keep the upper hand. Every gesture, every smile, every word mattered now. I couldn't let my emotions betray the careful mask I wore. Sliding the chair back slightly, I gestured toward the laptop on the desk. "I'm going over some household documents," I said, my tone casual. Inside, I was already calculating who had access, who could potentially leverage knowledge of my inheritance, and how Brian might inadvertently or intentionally act as a conduit. It wasn't long before the mysterious folder appeared. Brian placed it on the corner of the desk as if by accident, yet I could feel the precision behind the action. The folder contained a contract proposing joint management of assets. It was formal, meticulous, but something about it reeked of overreach, as if my consent was a given, assumed without discussion. My pulse quickened as I opened the folder, scanning line after line. The legalese was standard, yet subtle clauses hinted at undue authority over my funds. My stomach knotted with a mixture of shock and caution. I closed the folder slowly, forcing my breathing to settle. There it was, the first overt test of boundaries, delivered with a polite smile and a false sense of security. Brian's eyes met mine briefly, then flicked away toward the window. "I just thought it'd be easier if he started, but I cut him off with a small shake of my head. "Let me review this on my own," I said calmly, though inside a surge of alertness coursed through me. The stakes were higher now. I wasn't just protecting money, I was defending the agency I had fought for all my life. Retreating into my study, I began constructing a decoy plan. A monitored USB, a fake account that mirrored my real holdings, and subtle traps designed to reveal any untoward attempts. All of it was laid out mentally before I even touched a pen. The thrill of planning, the satisfaction of preparing for contingencies, outweighed the simmering anger I felt. I could feel the empowerment build in the quiet corners of the room, each calculated move a silent declaration that I would not be caught off guard. I reflected on past patterns, how my parents had always orchestrated situations, testing patience and resilience, seeing who would yield under pressure. The lessons were bitter, yet invaluable. Every subtle manipulation I had endured sharpened my perception. Every invisible burden carried in silence now fueled my strategic thinking. I recognized familiar rhythms, small suggestions, veiled questions, pauses pregnant with expectation. The family had underestimated me for years, and today that would work in my favor. Afternoon light waned into a soft golden haze as I examined every line of the contract again, mapping contingencies, considering motives, anticipating reactions. Brian entered the study intermittently, ostensibly to check on paperwork, but undeniably adding pressure, his presence a subtle reminder that any action I took would be observed. I met his gaze with calm resolve, noting every micro-expression, tightened jaw, raised brow, fleeting smirk, and stored it away in my mental ledger. Observation was a weapon, and I wielded it quietly, deliberately. At one point, the doorbell rang, and I found Lyora on the porch, a quiet smile playing on her lips. She handed me a small envelope, unmarked, and nodded once before retreating. Inside was a note, almost a whisper of advice. Patterns repeat. Trust instincts. That was all, yet it validated my calculations. I wasn't alone in noticing the subtle choreography around me. Allies might be few, but even a single discreet observer could tilt the balance. I spent the remainder of the afternoon in a deliberate rhythm. Review, plan, anticipate, observe. Each time Brian left the room, I revisited the documents, tweaking the decoy account and arranging minor cues to test reactions. My fingers traced the ledger lines as though absorbing the weight of responsibility that accompanied the hidden fortune. Every decision now was both defensive and strategic. I was no longer just the youngest daughter, overlooked and underestimated. I was a force of calculation, prepared to expose ambition where it would reveal itself. Evening approached, the light dimming to a gentle amber. The quiet of the house contrasted sharply with the tension simmering beneath every polite exchange earlier that day. I moved to the dining room, setting out papers and a laptop, ensuring that my setup looked innocuous but ready for observation. The faint clink of cutlery from the kitchen, Brian preparing something simple yet purposeful, reminded me that every domestic detail could mask a test, a probe, or a trap. I acknowledged the pressure with a measured exhale, translating anxiety into readiness. By nightfall, I had a mental map of the family's tendencies, Brian's subtle cues, and the timing of potential moves against me. The decoy, the monitored USB, the careful document preparation, all lay in wait for the first significant action. It was only a matter of time. I felt a cautious thrill, a tension that sparked adrenaline and clarity simultaneously. This was no longer passive observation. It was active preparation, a calculated dance where the stakes were not merely money, but trust, autonomy, and respect. Before stepping away from the desk to make a cup of tea, I allowed myself a moment of reflection. The past, with all its silent sacrifices and overlooked contributions, had trained me for this confrontation. I wasn't just reacting, I was anticipating. Every subtle gesture, every whispered remark, every casual glance from the family or Brian became data, feeding the intricate mental strategy I had woven throughout the afternoon. I looked at the clock and noted the time. The day was closing, but the real test had yet to arrive. I placed the folder back in its discreet hiding spot, double-checked the decoy setup, and allowed myself a small, private smile. The game had begun, and I was no longer a passive participant. The stage was set, and every move I had made prepared me to respond with precision, patience, and intelligence. By the late afternoon, sunlight had shifted to a warm golden hue, sliding across the living room floor and casting soft shadows around the room. I had just returned from the study, where I double-checked the decoy accounts and ensured that every subtle trap was in place. As I set my cup of tea down, I could feel the tension in the air, the kind that isn't announced with words but hangs in the pauses, the sideways glances, the faint tightening of a jaw. The day had begun with mundane chores and casual conversation, but nothing about it felt ordinary. I knew better now. Every small gesture carried weight. Brian lingered in the kitchen, ostensibly making a snack, but I could tell he was already probing the boundaries I had set. His smile was polite but deliberate, the kind that suggested he knew more than he should. I observed him surreptitiously from the corner of my eye, my fingers tracing the edge of the table as I sipped tea, calculating, noting every subtle nuance. The quiet of the house was deceptive. It was thick with anticipation. My parents arrived shortly after, bringing Bryn in tow. They moved through the living room with practiced smiles and polite conversation, but beneath their veneer, there was a tension I had long learned to recognize. Their questions began innocuously, almost casual. "Sloan, have you considered how to manage your new assets with your household plans?" my mother asked, tilting her head slightly, her eyes scanning for a reaction. I met her gaze evenly, measuring my words carefully. "I have a few strategies in mind," I replied calmly, "but I prefer to review everything thoroughly before making any commitments." Bryn chimed in with a delicate laugh. "Oh, Sloan, we just want to make sure you're thinking ahead. You know, it's important for the family to stay involved in these matters." The smile was sweet, but the implication hung in the air. The youngest daughter's inheritance was not entirely her own. I felt the familiar pang of being underestimated, of being seen as someone to manage rather than someone capable of independent decisions. I leaned back in my chair, keeping my composure, but my mind was sharp, cataloging every glance, every tone, every small pause. It was clear they were attempting to probe, to uncover a weakness, to see if I could be subtly manipulated or pressured. I allowed a slight nod, a measured smile, acknowledging their presence without revealing the depth of my awareness. Brian stepped closer, ostensibly to check on the paperwork, and my gaze met his. I noticed the micro-expressions, the fleeting curiosity in his eyes as they flicked toward my laptop. He was testing boundaries, likely unaware of the decoy measures I had implemented. My pulse quickened, not with fear, but with the thrill of anticipation. Every move he made was cataloged, assessed, and countered silently. Moving to the kitchen, I busied myself with small tasks, pouring water, adjusting utensils, arranging napkins. But my eyes remained vigilant. The room felt charged, every word and movement weighted with unspoken intent. My parents asked another question, softer this time, almost casual. "Sloan, how do you envision balancing your new responsibilities with our family legacy?" I allowed a quiet chuckle to escape, a sound that masked the calculation behind my eyes. "I intend to make thoughtful choices, and I trust that clarity and careful planning will guide me," I said, carefully neutral, letting them hear confidence but no hint of vulnerability. Bryn, attempting to insert a cheerful air, dropped another comment. "It's just wonderful that you've inherited such a gift, Sloan. I mean, Grandpa always had a soft spot for you." The words were coated with faux warmth, yet I felt the undercurrent of possessiveness and curiosity. It was as though they were measuring my response, testing my limits, seeing if the weight of expectation would sway me. As the afternoon progressed, Brian moved closer to my laptop under the guise of assisting with household accounts. He didn't realize the decoy accounts were in place, each monitored, each capable of alerting me to the smallest deviation. I kept my posture relaxed, my movements casual, yet every subtle attempt he made was noted, catalogued, and stored as evidence. A faint thrill ran through me as I anticipated the moment he would reveal his intentions, his first misstep. Between careful observation and internal strategizing, I recalled past sacrifices, the countless ways I had been overlooked, dismissed, or even manipulated by family members. Each recollection fueled a simmering determination to remain composed yet prepared. I realized that patience and meticulous planning were my greatest tools. My frustration transformed into focused energy, sharpening every instinct, every calculation, every reaction I might need. Evening light crept across the windows, bathing the room in soft amber. I retreated briefly to the study, checking emails and organizing my notes. The quiet hum of the laptop and the faint tick of the clock offered a counterpoint to the tension coiling in the living room. I reminded myself that observation was as vital as action. Sometimes, the first move was best left to the opponent. Through the study doorway, I glimpsed my parents and Bryn lingering near the dining table, sharing hushed words, their expressions barely concealing the curiosity and ambition that lingered behind polite smiles. I cataloged their postures, noting micro-expressions that betrayed concern and desire in equal measure. It was clear they intended to test boundaries, probe for weaknesses, and perhaps even redirect Brian's influence. Returning to the kitchen for a brief moment, I allowed myself a sip of water, letting the coolness steady my nerves. The sun dipped lower, casting elongated shadows across the floors, giving the room a sense of private intimacy, yet unspoken tension. I felt the weight of anticipation, the thrill of preparedness, and the resolve that each subtle maneuver, both by me and by those testing me, was part of a larger game. As the day faded into early evening, Brian made a quiet attempt to access the decoy account, unaware that his actions were being silently recorded and monitored. I noticed immediately the faint hesitation in his typing, the slightly too long pauses, the subtle shifts in expression that gave away intent. A quiet smile curved my lips. The first move had been his, as I had anticipated, and now the field of play was fully active. I allowed myself a brief moment to breathe, savoring the mental victory and reinforcing the awareness that every action I took now had purpose and consequence. The patterns were clear, the strategies laid, and the anticipation for the next move coiled like a spring within me. I felt empowered, alert, and ready. My family might try to manipulate, Brian might probe, but I was no longer merely reacting. I was directing the flow of the game. The evening sun filtered through the tall windows, painting streaks of gold across the living room floor. I had barely set my keys down when I sensed the familiar tension in the room, the kind that lingers, unspoken but unmistakable, like the faint hum of electricity in the air before a storm. The events of earlier in the day, the decoy accounts, the cautious maneuvers, Brian's subtle probing, were still fresh in my mind. I knew that the night ahead would demand more than quiet observation. It would demand assertion, tact, and patience. Brian was lounging casually on the couch, pretending to read, but I knew better. The slight curl of his lips when I glanced at him, the fleeting glance toward my study, betrayed his interest in more than just casual conversation. My parents hovered nearby, careful not to appear intrusive, yet their presence felt heavy, a quiet assertion of family expectation and authority. Bryn lingered at the doorway, her smile poised, eyes darting to gauge my reaction. It was a carefully orchestrated scene, a subtle dance, each step choreographed to see if I would falter. I sipped my tea deliberately, letting the warmth calm the fire simmering beneath my skin. I knew that any outward reaction could be read, analyzed, and exploited. My family had always been experts at gauging the slightest sign of weakness, and I would not give them that satisfaction tonight. As I settled onto the armchair, I allowed my mind to trace the contours of the room, cataloging positions, gestures, and micro-expressions. Every glance was a piece of data, every pause a potential clue. "Have you thought more about how you might manage everything, Sloane?" my mother asked, voice light but carrying a subtle weight. It wasn't just curiosity, it was a probe. I met her gaze steadily, letting a faint smile soften the edge of my controlled demeanor. "I've been considering several approaches," I replied, careful to keep my tone neutral yet confident. "I plan to make decisions after thorough review and reflection." Bryn's laugh, delicate and seemingly spontaneous, punctuated the space between them. "Oh, Sloane, we're only trying to be helpful. You know, everyone wants what's best for the family. It's just wise to think ahead, right?" The words were sweet on the surface, but beneath them lay the familiar undertone, a quiet assertion of control, a test of compliance. I nodded once, deliberately, and let my gaze drift toward the hallway, signaling attentiveness without giving away my inner calculations. My eyes flicked briefly to Brian, who shifted slightly on the couch. He spoke softly, almost casually. "Maybe we should look at the numbers together tonight. Make sure everything aligns with our long-term plans." I caught the subtle emphasis on "our," the quiet assumption that I would acquiesce without resistance. My pulse quickened, not in fear, but in sharp, focused awareness. I knew that my next move would set the tone. I rose to refill my tea, letting the movement appear casual. As I poured the water, my mind replayed years of subtle manipulation, missed opportunities, and veiled family expectations. Each recollection sharpened my resolve. No longer would I merely observe, I would assert my boundaries with measured precision. I carried the tea back to my chair and set it down, carefully maintaining eye contact with Brian and Bryn. A faint thrill ran through me as I prepared for the subtle confrontation, knowing that my next words and actions would be deliberate, chosen to establish clarity without provoking outright conflict. The conversation shifted, moving through safe topics, yet every sentence carried undercurrents of expectation and implication. "Sloane, have you considered the best way to integrate your assets with Brian's accounts?" my father asked, a casual inquiry loaded with suggestion. I allowed a calm laugh to escape, the sound soft but edged with authority. "I appreciate your concern," I said evenly, "but I prefer to review the details privately and ensure any integration is based on informed decisions, not assumptions." Brian's eyes flickered toward me, curiosity piqued, but I held my gaze. He hesitated, then leaned back, feigning disinterest, though the subtle tension in his posture betrayed him. Bryn's lips pressed into a thin line, a flicker of annoyance passing quickly as she recalibrated her strategy. My parents exchanged a brief, almost imperceptible glance, acknowledging that their subtle probing had met with resistance. I allowed a moment of silence to stretch, letting the weight of my composure settle over the room. It was a deliberate strategy. The quiet assertion of boundaries often speaks louder than overt confrontation. I reviewed the subtle traps I had prepared. The decoy accounts, the monitored USB drives, the careful documentation of any overreach. Tonight, I would not merely defend, I would establish that I was no longer a passive participant in their schemes. A cousin, attempting to maintain a veneer of casual conversation, mentioned a passing remark about my inheritance. "I heard Grandpa left quite the surprise for the youngest," they said lightly, yet the tone carried the weight of expectation. My lips curved in a small, controlled smile. I recognized the ploy immediately, an attempt to provoke, to unsettle, to gauge my reaction. I responded lightly, with calm assurance. Grandpa was thoughtful. I'm planning to honor his wishes in my own way. The subtle deflection allowed me to assert control without revealing strategy. The evening deepened, shadows lengthening across the walls. Brian made another attempt to bring up joint management of assets, casually suggesting, "We could streamline things, make sure everything is aligned from the start." I met his gaze with measured steadiness. "I understand your concern," I replied, "but I'll decide how to manage my affairs once I've evaluated all the details. Rushing won't benefit anyone." Internally, I cataloged each expression, each shift in tone. My parents' restrained smiles, Bryn's slight tightening of the jaw, Brian's brief flicker of impatience, all data points reinforcing my position. My mind worked rapidly, mapping potential scenarios, calculating reactions, and preparing contingencies. The simmering tension around me was no longer a threat. It was a canvas on which I could assert authority, demonstrating that manipulation would not succeed without consequence. As night settled, the room quieted. The subtle pressures had been met with calm. The probing questions countered with deliberate statements, and the family had glimpsed, if only subtly, that I would not bend easily. I felt a small thrill of satisfaction, tempered by the knowledge that the real tests were yet to come. My strategies had held, my boundaries were clear, and I had asserted my agency without losing composure. I stood, stretching lightly, and allowed a final glance around the room. Every expression, every slight shift in posture had been observed. And the day's encounters had provided information, and I would act on it when the moment demanded. Tonight, I had made my presence and boundaries unmistakably clear. The evening settled over Houston with a calm that was almost deceiving. Shadows stretched across the rooms, folding into corners and casting subtle patterns on the walls. I moved quietly from my study to the dining room, carrying a tablet loaded with decoy accounts and carefully tracked documents. The air was heavy, thick with the unspoken tension that had become our new normal, as though the house itself were bracing for the unfolding storm. Earlier in the day, subtle interactions and probing remarks had confirmed what I suspected. My family, alongside Brian, were testing boundaries, measuring reactions, and gauging just how far they could push me. Now, with the traps I had set, every action and misstep they made would be recorded, monitored, and cataloged for the day I chose to act decisively. My heartbeat maintained a steady rhythm, though internally my mind raced with contingency plans, potential responses, and the observation of every subtle shift in expression from those around me. I paused briefly at the doorway to the living room, noting Brian's position on the couch, attempting casual composure while his eyes flicked toward the papers on my desk. Bryn lingered nearby, a delicate smile that didn't reach her eyes as she hovered, observing. My parents remained seated with quiet attentiveness, their questions now more probing, laced with thinly veiled concern and curiosity about my inheritance. Every glance, every half-smile, carried weight. I knew this was the perfect moment to begin active defense, not through confrontation yet, but through deliberate preparation and subtle interference. Sable had arrived quietly, her presence almost ethereal, but immediately unnerving. She moved with deliberate casualness, lingering near the kitchen island where I had set my monitoring equipment. Her eyes flicked toward the ledger I had left open, and I felt a twinge of frustration. She wasn't acting alone. Her movements were deliberate, testing, probing. Twist S12 had begun. My mind assessed, recalculated, and adjusted the decoy account's permissions. Every digital footprint I left was now part of a controlled experiment, a carefully orchestrated observation of their intent. "Just making sure everything is in order," Sable said lightly, her tone syrupy with feigned innocence. But I knew the undertone: covert interest, probing curiosity, the subtle push to observe my reactions. I smiled politely, letting my expression remain calm, while inside I tensed, ready to spring traps I had meticulously planned. "Of course," I replied evenly. "I always like to double-check. It's easy for small mistakes to compound, you know." The implied warning was soft, but the meaning was unmistakable. Hours passed with measured interaction. I moved from my study to the dining room, sipping tea deliberately while observing every micro-expression. Brian, meanwhile, attempted another subtle suggestion regarding account integration, leaning slightly forward, his hands barely brushing the table in a gesture meant to signal cooperation but carry implicit assumption. I noted the movement and made an adjustment to the monitored decoy accounts, ensuring any attempt to access assets without explicit authorization would be recorded. Suddenly, an alert pinged softly from my tablet. Twist S13. Someone had attempted to move funds associated with Grandpa's memento, a family heirloom with both emotional and financial significance. My pulse quickened, not with fear, but with sharp, controlled alertness. I moved quietly to the study, pulling up the monitoring feed. The attempt was subtle, almost hesitant, and yet detectable. My fingers danced across the keyboard, rerouting access, locking permissions, and triggering a discrete notification designed to inform me of any further attempts. The thrill of controlled aggression coursed through me, a validation of the preparations I had spent days meticulously arranging. I allowed a breath, reflecting on the patterns I had learned over years of family interactions. These maneuvers, subtle, patient, and precise, were necessary because confrontation without preparation would be catastrophic. I recalled every small manipulation, every indirect remark, every look of expectation, and reinforced my resolve they would not underestimate me again. My empowerment was not loud or flashy, but it was deliberate and firm. Sable lingered, unaware that her actions were documented, her subtle attempts at interference neutralized before they could bear fruit. Brian glanced toward me again, his casual posture now tinged with uncertainty, though he did not vocalize it. My parents, sensing a shift in energy, exchanged quiet glances. Even Bryn's expression tightened imperceptibly. She had begun to recognize that the rules of engagement had changed, and I was no longer the passive participant they had anticipated. By late evening, the house was quiet. The storm had not yet fully broken, but the first waves had hit, controlled, and measured, leaving ripples of tension in their wake. I moved to the window overlooking the garden, the city lights twinkling faintly in the distance. My mind ran through every contingency, every potential escalation. I understood now. The opposition was coordinated, deliberate, and ambitious. But so was I. I checked the decoy accounts one final time, ensuring every alert was active, every potential loophole sealed. The night deepened, shadows lengthening, but I felt no fear, only readiness. I had taken control of the battlefield without needing overt confrontation, demonstrating that subtle action, intelligence, and patience could shift power dynamics significantly. Every action taken, every precaution established, was a message. Underestimate me, and the consequences would be severe. My pulse slowed as I prepared mentally for the escalation I knew was imminent. The family might believe they were maneuvering undetected, but every move had revealed their underestimation, and I was prepared to show them the cost. I settled back into the chair, sipping the last of my tea, eyes scanning the quiet rooms for the faintest hint of activity. The evening was long, the tension palpable, but I had already begun to tip the scales in my favor. In this game, subtlety, observation, and calculated response were my weapons, and I wielded them with precision. The early night in Houston was quiet outside, but inside my home, the air hummed with an invisible tension, thick enough to touch. I moved deliberately through the hall, checking the monitors I had set up the previous evening. Each decoy account was active, each USB secured, every alert system ready. The calculated defenses were in place. I could hear the faint murmur of conversation in the living room where Brian and my family had gathered. Shadows stretched across the walls, dancing lightly as the lamps flickered. It was the calm before the storm, but unlike previous nights, I knew the storm would break tonight, directly, and with full force. I paused in the study doorway, my gaze scanning the living room. My parents, ever so careful to mask their curiosity with polite smiles, were now leaning slightly forward, eyes darting toward me whenever I moved. Bryn lingered near the sofa, holding a wine glass with deliberate nonchalance. Every gesture, every glance, carried weight. Brian, seemingly relaxed, had that slight smirk I had learned to interpret over the last few days, an audacity that masked uncertainty. The game was escalating, and the first moves had already been made, setting the stage for the ultimate confrontation. I made my way to the desk and double-checked the digital feeds. Every decoy account reflected normalcy, yet I could track any subtle attempts at access. My mind raced through the possible scenarios. Brian's previous attempts had been careful, testing the boundaries of my defenses. Now I anticipated a bolder maneuver. My pulse was steady, but inside, a controlled adrenaline surged. I was ready. Twist S14 was imminent. I moved quietly toward the living room, as if by coincidence, sipping tea slowly. "You're awfully quiet tonight," Bryn remarked lightly, her tone syrupy but sharp enough to hint at underlying intent. I smiled faintly, letting the gesture mask the careful calculations running through my mind. "Just enjoying the calm before the weekend," I said evenly, knowing she understood more than my words suggested. Their subtle probing was a dance I had learned to follow and manipulate, step by step. Brian shifted in his seat, glancing toward the tablet on my desk, just out of reach. "Sloan, have you considered consolidating the accounts? Might make things easier for both of us." His words sounded innocuous, but I recognized the intent. A soft push to test compliance, to measure reaction. I let a small pause hang before responding. "I think it's best to keep some elements separate for now. There's value in clarity, don't you think?" The slight inflection conveyed firmness without aggression, a reminder that boundaries were not to be crossed. Sable, who had joined earlier, moved subtly near the sofa armrest, her eyes flicking toward the ledger I had left open. Twist S15 was in motion. Greg, my quiet ally, had captured a brief clip the day before. Brian had been boastful in his own living room, discussing potential manipulation and access to my inheritance. I pulled the video up on my tablet, allowing a moment for it to play back. The smug expression on Brian's face as he spoke, his intentions hit the room's air like a sudden gust. I let it linger, nonchalant yet deliberate. "Funny, isn't it?" I said softly, allowing the words to settle. "How easily intentions reveal themselves when you think no one is watching." My gaze swept the room, locking onto Brian, Bryn, and my parents. The video played again on the screen, evidence undeniable. I could see subtle changes, Brian's jaw tightening, Bryn's eyes widening for just a fraction, my parents exchanging a glance that betrayed a flicker of surprise. Their confidence faltered, and I sensed the momentum had shifted. I wasn't just defending, I was asserting, demonstrating that every observation, every calculated trap, had been noticed, and that every misstep would have consequences. Twist S14 and S15 converged here, a symphony of anticipation and strategy. Brian tried to cover, attempting a casual tone. "I'm sure there's some misunderstanding. Maybe we should talk privately." But the effect was minimal. My internal reflection reminded me of every slight, every dismissal, every subtle manipulation over the years. Grandpa's lessons echoed in my mind: patience, observation, and strategy. This confrontation was the culmination of those principles. I held my composure, measured and confident. The living room became a stage for the clash of subtle wills. I could sense the tension radiating, Bryn attempting small gestures to regain control, Sable testing boundaries with minor provocations, and my parents quietly calculating their next move. Yet I was ready. Every misstep would be logged, every overreach recorded. My internal monologue mapped their intentions, predicting reactions and counter-reactions with precision. A sudden shift occurred when Bryn, attempting to mask panic, leaned closer, her voice soft but pointed. "Sloan, maybe you're overreacting. We're family." I held her gaze calmly, letting the silence stretch, forcing acknowledgement of the balance of power. "Family is precious," I said carefully, "but it doesn't mean I can't protect what's mine." The statement landed like a subtle hammer, clear and unwavering. Brian attempted a final maneuver, reaching for the tablet under the guise of collaboration. I observed every micro-expression, every slight lean, and then calmly stepped closer, placing my hand over the device. "Let's not rush," I said, steady and deliberate. Every ounce of control was mine. The room understood without further argument. Their moves, though calculated, had been anticipated. Evening deepened into night, and the room seemed to hold its breath. The confrontation had escalated, stakes had peaked, and yet I maintained a serene exterior while internally processing, planning, and preparing for the final engagement that would determine the ultimate outcome. Every trap, every monitoring device, and every recorded confession had led to this pivotal moment. The balance had shifted, and I knew it. The house was unusually still as night deepened in Houston, the kind of stillness that only precedes an upheaval. I moved through the softly lit hallway, careful not to disturb the tension that had gathered like a living thing in every room. My hands brushed against the edge of the tablet, confirming the video feed was ready. Every decoy account, every alert, every recorded confession had been arranged to perfection. The pieces were in place. This was no longer preparation, this was execution. I felt the weight of the moment settle on my shoulders, tempered by the clarity of knowing exactly what I had to do. I entered the living room with a calmness that belied the storm I had orchestrated. Brian and my parents, seated awkwardly, glanced up as I approached. Their eyes were a mixture of arrogance and unease, unaware that the outcome was already written in the traps I had designed. Bryn adjusted her posture, attempting a casual elegance, but the slight tremor in her fingers betrayed a flicker of concern. Every subtle glance and motion was catalogued in my mind, every potential reaction anticipated. The subtle tension was electric, waiting to be released. "Thank you all for joining me tonight," I began, voice steady and clear. "I thought it best we review some matters together. Transparency seems appropriate at this stage." My words landed lightly, but the implication was heavy. Brian's smile tightened, a momentary lapse that suggested the first crack in his composure. My parents exchanged a glance, calculating, trying to mask the sudden shift in the room's energy. I gestured toward the table, where the folder containing all critical evidence lay neatly. "These documents reflect the agreements and intentions that have been circulating," I continued. "I'd like us to review them in detail." I watched Brian's eyes narrow, the slight flush on Bryn's cheeks confirming that they had underestimated me. I could feel my heart rate steady in response to the pressure. Triumph was a quiet, simmering presence within me. The video recording I had placed on the tablet played, revealing Brian's earlier boasts about manipulating accounts and attempting unauthorized access to my inheritance. The digital footprints traced the paths he had tried to tread, each step meticulously caught by the decoy systems I had installed. My parents' expressions shifted from casual curiosity to shock, realization dawning that their collusion had been transparent all along. The room's air thickened with disbelief. "Did you really think I wouldn't notice?" I said softly, letting the words linger, the calmness in my tone cutting deeper than any raised voice could. Brian's attempt at a defensive response faltered. He searched my expression for a hint of miscalculation, but found none. Bryn's poised exterior crumbled slightly, and my parents' usual commanding presence gave way to hesitation. Every carefully laid plan they had relied on was now exposed, reflected back at them in undeniable clarity. I guided the conversation forward, calmly stating my terms. "The assets must remain under my control. Any attempts at manipulation will be void, and any claims on my inheritance rescinded. Brian, I want our annulment finalized with no further interference. And to my family, your past disregard for my contributions and autonomy will no longer dictate my present or future." The room was silent, but for the faint hum of the evening air conditioner, the weight of my words settling heavily. Their faces revealed the recognition of defeat without the need for further argument. Brian's eyes flickered with anger, but the strategic placement of the evidence left him with no room to maneuver. Bryn's attempts at casual conversation evaporated in the wake of the unyielding clarity I projected. My parents could only sit in stunned silence, the accumulation of their past negligence and attempts at control finally meeting an irrefutable boundary. I allowed a reflective pause, taking in the scene. Every sacrifice, every long-standing pattern of being overlooked had led to this moment. I felt empowered, not by vindictiveness, but by the confirmation that careful strategy and steadfast awareness could protect what was rightfully mine. Grandpa's voice echoed in my memory. Patience and observation would always outlast impulsive action. The payoff was not just in exposing deception, but in asserting my own autonomy fully. As the final documents were acknowledged, signed, and notarized under my direction, the room's energy shifted. What had been tension and uncertainty transformed into resolution and acknowledgement of my boundaries. The confrontation, though intense, had concluded in a manner that demonstrated control, intelligence, and the subtle authority I had cultivated over years of being underestimated. Yet, even in victory, the residual tension of family dynamics remained. The broader emotional fallout, the relationships strained or broken by years of subtle manipulation and neglect, lingered as a silent reminder that while legal and strategic triumph could be achieved, the complexities of human attachment and history were not so easily resolved. The morning sunlight spilled through the plantation shutters, casting soft stripes across the living room. For the first time in days, the house felt genuinely quiet, as if the tension that had hung so densely in the air had finally lifted. I sank into the armchair by the window, letting the warmth of the sun touch my face. The storm of confrontation had passed, yet in the silence, I could feel the subtle residue of it, lingering in the corners of my mind. I took a deep breath, allowing myself to reflect without interruption. Yesterday had been the culmination of every calculated step I had taken since discovering my inheritance. Every decoy, every recording, every carefully plotted move had led to clarity and resolution. I could finally evaluate the damage, the losses, and the remnants of trust that had frayed over years of neglect and subtle manipulation. I realized that while the legal and financial victory was complete, the emotional work of reclaiming my life had only begun. Brian and the key family members who had once schemed against me were noticeably subdued. Brian's eyes avoided mine, his pride bruised, his arrogance deflated by undeniable evidence. My parents, on the other hand, sat stiffly, alternating between regret and stubbornness. I noted their expressions carefully, weighing what could be salvaged and what needed permanent boundaries. While some genuine remorse flickered across my mother's face, my father's rigid posture suggested a lingering sense of entitlement, one that would require continued vigilance. I decided that partial estrangement was necessary. Certain relationships, while blood-bound, could no longer be permitted to influence my autonomy. I reached out to my attorney to ensure all legal measures were firmly in place, double-checking documents, transfer of assets, and the annulment agreement with Brian. It was a delicate balance, ensuring fairness while preserving my safety and independence. I knew that empowerment was not about retaliation, but about safeguarding oneself with intelligence and foresight. Settling into my home office, I began organizing my personal projects. The stack of notebooks, digital files, and plans for my career expansion waited patiently. I allowed myself a small, satisfied smile. For the first time, I could act on my ambitions without interference or fear of subversion. And my mind wandered to the years I had quietly contributed to a family that never acknowledged my efforts. The sacrifices, the late nights, the careful consideration of others' needs before my own. The vindication I felt was quiet, yet profound. It was not just in winning, it was in recognizing my own worth and exercising agency. Throughout the day, I reached out to my closest allies. Lyora, who had subtly warned me of Brian's initial probing, stopped by for a brief coffee and conversation. We laughed softly over past family absurdities, sharing a warmth that was absent from the calculated coldness of my immediate family. Her presence reminded me that connections built on trust and genuine care were still possible, that the anchor of hope was not lost amidst betrayal. I realized that rebuilding my world would involve cultivating these healthy relationships, ones where mutual respect and honesty were foundational. As the afternoon unfolded, I took a quiet walk around the neighborhood. Houston's streets shimmered in the late sun, children's laughter echoing faintly from the park nearby. I felt a deep sense of relief and empowerment, knowing that I had navigated the most treacherous aspects of familial manipulation with composure and intelligence. Every decision had been deliberate, every action measured. I had preserved not only my assets, but also my dignity. By evening, I returned home, settling into the familiar comfort of my study. I reviewed my notes, making strategic plans for the months ahead, projects, travel, personal growth. The calm was almost surreal after the high-stakes confrontation that had dominated the past days. Yet beneath the calm, a cautious realism persisted. Family dynamics, even with legal and financial boundaries in place, are not erased by a single victory. I reminded myself that vigilance, wisdom, and patience would continue to serve as allies in maintaining my autonomy and protecting against potential manipulations. The final reflection came quietly, in the soft glow of my desk lamp. I acknowledged the lingering emotional scars, the subtle betrayals and dismissals, the years of being treated as the burdened youngest child. But I also recognized my own resilience, my capacity for strategic thought, and my ability to stand firmly in the face of adversity. I understood that true freedom was not the absence of conflict, but the mastery over how one responds to it. My autonomy, intelligence, and moral clarity were my true inheritance, more valuable than any financial gain. As night fell, I wrote a brief note to myself, a reminder of lessons learned and the path forward. Trust would be rebuilt selectively, love would be cultivated cautiously, and independence would remain paramount. I placed the note in the drawer, alongside a photograph of Grandpa, whose wisdom had guided me in ways I was only beginning to fully appreciate. The weight of past burdens lifted slightly, replaced by a quiet, enduring sense of empowerment and cautious optimism. I looked around the house, now peaceful, and smiled softly. The confrontation had ended, the traps had been revealed, and the deceptive hands that once sought to control me had been shown their limits. But more importantly, I had reclaimed my life. My freedom was no longer theoretical. It was lived, tangible, and firmly in my hands. As this story closes, it reminds us that resilience, intelligence, and self-respect are the truest forms of power. Even when family and loved ones betray or underestimate you, standing firm and protecting your boundaries can lead to both justice and personal growth. What would you do if you found yourself in a situation like Sloane's? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more gripping stories that explore betrayal, strategy, and the triumph of the human spirit.